Hello. In one of the first lectures in this series on ethics, I quoted the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer observed that it's easy to preach morality, but very difficult to find a basis for it. It's easy to preach morality, but difficult to find a basis for it. Up until this point with the lectures, we've been mostly addressing the easy side of this problem, so to speak, which is we've been attempting to formulate and articulate theoretical conceptions of what makes something the right thing to do, what makes an action ethical. How do we differentiate between a moral action and an immoral action, for example? With this lecture, I would like to turn to address the difficult prong of this fork, so to speak, and that's to say, to address the question of whether it's possible to provide a basis for these various theories of ethics. Clearly, it's something that, well, up until we've provided a basis for it in our own experience, until we've discovered a basis for it, we can still, in some way, abide by ethical standards, and abide by codes of ethics. But in some way, we're always going to be not exactly acting, not exactly pretending, but we'll be basically following a law or a rule, a structure of rules that is outside of us. And I think it's in some ways inevitable that we will always feel somewhat subjugated or repressed even. And so it might seem, well, I think this is a not uncommon conception. It will feel as though being ethical or being moral, doing the right thing, it always means giving something up. It means sacrificing something. And so with this lecture, I would like to address head-on the question, does being ethical entail some sort of sacrifice? And specifically as a sacrifice, I mean, am I giving something up by being moral? Am I somehow repressing something in order to do the right thing? Traditionally, very powerful answers to this question have been given by different religious traditions. In other words, to answer Schopenhauer's question, when we say it's difficult to provide a basis for morality, various traditional religions have managed to do that. Unfortunately, or well, I don't know if it's unfortunate, it's a fact in our time that these traditional religious conceptions, well, I think it's always been the case that the power of these religious bases for ethics, their power depends on the belief in the sort of metaphysical underpinnings that religion offers, and so this is to say, in order to successfully establish the basis for moral action, it depends on believing in these religious doctrines. Now, this is clearly, if to believe in these religious doctrines, religion then provides a sufficient basis to answer this question, and so in that way, it's resolved the problem that Schopenhauer presents. The difficulty is that in our time, in the 21st century, the nature of the world that we live in makes it such that, well, there are two difficulties with appealing to religion to answer this question. And this is not to say that it can't be done, but it's to say that it's presented with two serious disadvantages in appealing to a religious conception to answer this question. One of those is, objectively, it seems to be the case that through the process of kind of globalization and travel and interconnectivity between cultures of the world, it seems to the result of that seems to be an actual sort of disintegration of the integrity of homogeneous religious communities. This is not to say, again, that they no longer exist, but it's just to say that they don't exercise the same authority over civilization as they once did. A second problem that's related, it's related to the same source, is that no matter, even if you enjoy a strong and vibrant religious community, you nevertheless, it's almost impossible to live your life without encountering people who are outside of that same religious community. In other words, you will almost of necessity encounter people that don't share the same metaphysical and religious underpinnings in their view of what kind of place the cosmos is. The effect of this is that basically it will be exceedingly difficult to adjudicate between any potential sources of conflict, because any way of resolving conflicts, it would almost invariably depend on coming to some sort of shared agreement about this kind of fundamental or ultimate questions about what kind of place the world is. At one time, it might have been the case that a person could count on that most people he or she encountered would share those kind of metaphysical underpinnings. That's no longer the case today. We encounter so many diverse people from. Basically, we can assume. In the past, it might have been safe to assume that anyone you encountered would have shared your same conception, metaphysical and religious conception of the world. Today, it's almost the inverse of that. In other words, we can almost assume that somebody we meet doesn't necessarily share our same worldviews, our same metaphysical beliefs. And so, for those two reasons, I think, despite that the religious answer is one answer to Schopenhauer's problem, it leaves us still maybe attempting to seek another kind of answer. Another answer that we might give to Schopenhauer's problem is something like an organic basis or a holistic basis. And so again, despite that the religious basis, it's not entirely unsatisfactory. It still maybe leaves something to be desired in terms of in terms of something like a way of offering something to all people. So similarly, the organic basis, and I'll try to explain what I mean by that, or the holistic basis would be another way to say it. If I imagine the thumb of my hand, or a branch on a tree, if the thumb of my hand began to appropriate all of the nourishment from the rest of my body to itself, or a branch on a tree began to sort of draw all of the sap to itself and leave the rest of the tree to starve, I think it's really obvious. The thought experiment doesn't take much initiative to reveal that it won't be long before that kind of egoism on the part of the finger or on the branch actually comes at the branch's own expense. What I mean by that is the branch depends on the tree for its livelihood, its life. If the branch inadvertently sabotages the tree on which it depends, so much the worse for the branch. Now I think it's very I think we can come to the same conclusion in respect to our own individual lives, and what I mean by that is, if our lives cost too much to the society and the community and the civilization that we live in, again, it's pretty clear that it's so much the worse for our lives, because again, we depend on so many things around us, everything around us. That's easy to sort of just take as a matter of course or not think about really, but things like even electricity, being able to communicate through these videos, and the fact that we have roads and roofs over our heads, all these things we're depending on in the same way the branch depends upon the tree. we depend upon everyone around us who works for us, basically. Still, this kind of organic or social or holistic basis, despite that it's true, and in a similar way, the religious basis might be true. The trouble is, though, is that, the trouble with the religious basis, again, is it's not something that everyone can agree on. The trouble with the organic or the social or the holistic basis is that it's something that seems to be in the sort of to escape us. It's something that we're not always cognizant of. It seems as though our consciousness is much more self-centered, much less peripherally or socially or organically centered. And so I suppose the real question, the hardest question, and in some way of sort of, if we take Schopenhauer's challenge being, it's difficult to provide a basis for morality. If we think of the challenge and sort of take the bull by the horns, so to speak, we will have to address our answer to the question of whether it's possible to provide a basis for ethics using the departure point of kind of individual self-consciousness. So is it possible to provide a basis for ethics using the departure point of sort of personal self-consciousness? So that in some way is the challenge that I've set before us for this lecture. I think if we manage this, we've kind of addressed the question at its in the most challenging, most difficult way, and everything else will be comparatively straightforward. Now, I would like to, in some ways, connect what we're considering in this lecture to the lecture that came just before this, and I'm thinking of Rudolf Steiner. Later in the lecture, I'll also invoke some of Plato's work, and I think in some way they each offer answers to this question on the basis of individual self-consciousness. Their answers are similar, and they're also different in some respects, and so they serve to basically illuminate the problem from multiple aspects. But I will begin with Steiner, partly, largely because Steiner was the philosopher with whom we concluded the last lecture. And so, basically, a way that Steiner would approach this question is, if we think about the individual, we have to really know, because we're trying to address this question of whether being ethical involves some kind of sacrifice or some kind of giving something up. Like, I would prefer not to do the right thing, but instead I'm going to sort of be ethical and do the right thing, in spite of what I would prefer. Now, for Steiner, and I believe him, I think it's true what he says. When we think this way, we're actually we're making a mistake. We're failing to perceive the situation clearly. To try to explain what I mean, when we think of ourselves, that can mean different things. And Steiner he's very clear about identifying freedom as the sort of the pith of the self. And in other words, when we say I, it's a question of what we're referring to exactly. And when we have to invoke some of the terms from last video, I talked about gradients of the will, sort of transformations of the will, even a spectrum of the will, and it's a sort of 7-tone scale, moving from instinct, drive, urge, motive, wish, resolution, and so in other words, but the spectrum is ordered in a very clear way. And the order of the spectrum has to do with basically a manifestation of freedom. By the time we move from instinct to resolution, in the case of an instinct, we are in some way we're somehow in some way unfree. By that I mean that we don't choose the instinct. The instinct basically operates upon us. You know? And so we can clearly see that despite that we tend to immediately identify with the object of our instincts or the object or the object of our drives, of our urges. It's very clear that these can become, as we progress through these gradients of the will, the instincts, the urges, the drive, they become increasingly objective before us. And what that means is that despite that they're still related to us, they're still in some way exerting influence upon us, we're also not under compulsion by them. And it's clear that by the time we get to resolution, the will has in some ways been emancipated almost. It's been liberated from sort of pre-formed structures. So if we think of an instinct, by the time the instinct strikes us, the will has already taken on a determinate form, conditioned by unconscious processes. It's almost the reverse if we think about a resolution. From a resolution, we're working from something like a transcendental will. By that I mean it's a will that two things about it. One thing is that it's not preformed in the way that an instinct or a drive or an urge is. By the time we become conscious of a drive or an instinct or an urge, it already has a definitive form and a definitive object, and it's basically trying to compel us to live it out, to act it out. Almost the opposite is the case in respect to a resolution. From a resolution, we're participating in its creation from the very beginning, and so that's one way in which this is a transcendental form of the will. Another way in which it's transcendental is that it's not only, it doesn't come attached to an object in the way that if I'm thirsty, I have an urge to reach for a glass of water and I will do it unconsciously basically. And the water is the object to which my will is sort of preformed and pre-attached. But the resolution is different. And the resolution, we can see that it's not necessarily attached to an outer object. It doesn't come with the prior attachment in that way. Instead, it's transcendental, and in that sense, it actually, we ourselves, or in fact our instincts and our urges and our drives and our desires, they can become, in other words, our own psyches, our own souls, can become the object of our will. And that's what we think about with a resolution. With a resolution, we're almost working back upon ourselves. And so this is a really qualitatively different form of the will than something that's already attached to an object or to an outcome. Steiner is, again, it's always helpful to illuminate the thought of one philosopher by comparing it or contrasting it to others. And Steiner, two very useful foils or contrasts to Steiner's view. And they're useful in the sense that they both represent ways in which freedom is subverted. One foil to Steiner is the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche sees basically, he thinks of sort of the good or morality as basically the maximization of the will as such, not the conscious will, not the transcendental will, but rather the will in its basically its untransformed aspects. And so Nietzsche thinks of, Nietzsche certainly would view morality. That's not the right word to apply to Nietzsche. For Nietzsche, really, morality, his clear answer to whether morality or ethics involves some kind of sacrifice, whether it involves giving something up, he would have an unqualified answer to that question that yes, indeed, that ethics is a sort of a tool of repression. It's a way that we make ourselves less, make ourselves worse. And so for Nietzsche, some kind of the development or evolution of the self would actually mean strengthening and maximizing instinctual forms of the will. For Steiner, this is actually a subversion of freedom, and the reason is, to recapitulate from earlier videos, in some way we are the least free when we do what we please, when we do what we please according to our urges and our desires. We're the least free in those kind of situations, and the reason again is because the will in the form of a desire, it comes preformed and already attached to an object, and so it basically comes and it puts us under its compulsion, and we basically indenture ourselves to this desire. And so from Steiner's view, Nietzsche is actually advocating a capitulation to unfreedom. Another foil to Rudolf Steiner, which is kind of, it's almost as a Scylla and Charybdis. These are two almost opposite conceptions of ethics. And for Steiner, sort of, he recognizes aspects of truth in each of them, but also views them as one-sided. Nietzsche presents one foil, which is the kind of total liberation of all of the instinctual forces of the will. Kant represents Immanuel Kant, who will be familiar from earlier lectures. Kant represents almost the opposite extreme. He's radical in the sense of the kind of universalization or kind of abstract universalization of the will. So whereas Nietzsche sort of celebrates this kind of ultimate, well, for Nietzsche, he celebrates the sort of ultimate emancipation of individual instincts and desires and drives. Kant basically exalts something of a sort of abstract or universalization, almost an annihilation or abolition, of the sort of the individual consciousness, for the sake, so a sort of subjugation of the individual for the sake of following a universal moral maxim. And again, for Steiner, this is kind of well, it relinquishes freedom again. But the reason it relinquishes freedom is because again it's placing oneself under a sort of set of commandments, of universal commandments. This Steiner views as something that stifles the kind of the individual and unique aspect of every human being. So I hope that I was clear enough in showing how Nietzsche and Kant, they represent some kind of contrasts, and that Steiner manages to sort of skirt between them and not abolish the individual aspect, to not abolish the individual aspect, but also not to sort of just capitulate to a abstract moral maxim. And so I basically we've seen through these lectures some sort of progression, moving from utilitarianism to deontology to virtue ethics, and then to Steiner's theory of conscious human action. We've seen actually a progression that helps us to join these two sides of ethics that are can in some ways be very difficult to reconcile. One of them is knowing what the right thing to do is. So suppose you can perform accurate and precise utilitarian calculus, and so you know what the right action to do is. there's still a problem, because it's not at all self-evident that just because we know what the right thing to do is, that we'll actually do the right thing. But nevertheless, especially with virtue ethics, and especially with Steiner's approach to ethics, I think we've begun to find a way to basically reconcile this rift between knowing the good and actually doing the good. And again, so for Steiner, this comes from recognizing and identifying that place within us which is capable of free action. And again, by free action, this means action that's not conditioned by prejudices or desires that we have on the one side, and it's also not conditioned by exterior commandments or exterior constraints. And this is a point of freedom within ourselves. And from Steiner's view, once when we're able to experience that point of freedom, that can provide the font or the basis for moral action. And so again, the question to be answered is, it's not whether we can do what we want, but it's rather where the want itself, how that desire, how that want, or how that motive itself emerged from within us. In other words, were we conscious, and were we participating in its genesis, in its development, or was it something that just sort of came upon us in the night, almost like by surprise? And again, I think this is this difference is this difference is articulated throughout the spectrum of the will that I presented in the last video. If we think of instincts, desires, drives, urges, this is clear that they sort of take hold of us without our participation in creating them, in elaborating them. If we think of something like a resolution or an ideal, this is clear that what's the other side? It's the opposite side of the spectrum. It's very they wouldn't have come about. A resolution, it doesn't come about except from our initiative, except from our conscious participation, our conscious initiative in it. And so I think Steiner has provided us a way to bridge this gulf between knowing the good and doing the good. I spoke about this in greater length in earlier lectures. So if anyone is wondering or has questions, please consult the earlier lectures. I also think that Aristotle's approach to virtue ethics offers another way of reconciling what can become a sort of a chasm or a gulf between knowing what the right thing to do is and actually doing it. And this is through Aristotle's view of ethics as a sort of cultivation of character traits. So virtues, ethics as cultivating virtues to make one inclined or make one disposed to act in a way that's virtuous, that's befitting of a virtuous person. Now, so Plato offers another way of reconciling these two things, and also of providing a basis for ethics. It's certainly not antithetical to Steiner's view, but it takes somewhat of a different approach. For Steiner, and I think Steiner represents a much more contemporary consciousness. And what I mean by that is Steiner views the difference between knowing the good and doing the good as a sort of original condition. It's a problem that has to be solved. There's a famous line from St. Paul. He says something like, "To will is present with me, but how to perform that which is good I find not. For the good which I would, that I do not, and the evil which I would not, that I do." He's basically articulating this problem that also I think everyone is familiar with it, and it's certainly a problem that Steiner confronts, which is, again, this appears to be a gulf that we are charged with reconciling, knowing the good and actually doing it. Plato seems to take a different standpoint, and it might be an expression of just a more ancient form of consciousness. For Plato, there's no difference. And what I mean by that is that basically for Plato, when he says to know something, to know something, well, in Plato's view, if I say that I know something but I don't do it, if I say I know something is good but I don't act on it, I shouldn't really have said that I know it. It's like if I know that getting on an airplane is safe, but every time I get on the airplane I start to shake and I'm terribly afraid. I don't really know that getting on an airplane is safe. I might say those words, but in fact, what I know in my bones is that I'm terrified to be on an airplane. And so, for Plato, knowledge is action in some sense. For Plato, it doesn't confront him as, well, the problem of what if I know the right thing but don't actually do it? That doesn't seem to confront Plato. He views it as imperfect knowledge if it doesn't immediately inform our action. And I think both of these views is certainly justifiable in each way. In some way, it is clear that we can know something, but nevertheless, sort of find our wills to be somehow insufficient or impotent to accomplish what we know, what we wish to accomplish. At the same time, it might also be said that we don't really know it with sufficient power if it's not adequate to inspire or enkindle our wills to act on it in that way. But so again, Plato begins from the departure point that knowledge is imperfect until it flows immediately into action, and so basically Plato addresses this question of whether ethics involves some kind of repression or some kind of sacrifice. Probably most famously in the Republic, which is again among Plato's foremost works, most memorable works. Plato basically, in the Republic, he's attempting to do something that's almost impossible, in principle almost impossible, which is to articulate a form. And a form means, well, in that same book, one way he tries to articulate the nature of forms is by presenting the allegory of the cave. And so he basically, he gives the image of human beings chained in the bottom of a cavern, and they're facing down into the cavern, so they're facing the back wall. And all they see are shadows that are cast by a fire that's behind them. They have no inkling of the source of those shadows, so they're only seeing effects. They're only seeing the effects, they're only seeing phenomena. They're not seeing the causes of those effects. They're not seeing the causes of the phenomena. And that, given that that's all they've ever seen their whole lives, they naturally assume that those effects that those effects explain themselves, that the phenomena, there's nothing that causes the phenomena. Plato's image of the philosophical ascent, which is also the sort of intellection of forms, is he gives the image of a person escaping out of the cave. And basically, in the first instance, this person will discover the way in which the fire that's behind the people, that has been behind him until that moment, is actually creating those shadows on the wall behind him. First, he will see, in other words, he will perceive the causal origins of the effects, and next he will, though, actually escape the cave itself, and so he'll have a sort of an overarching or holistic or bird's eye view, so to speak, of the whole arrangement. For Plato, this kind of direct perception of the source of light, the sun, this is an image for the intellection or the intuition of forms. Now it's clear that a question that Plato sets out to answer in the Republic is, what is justice? What is the form of justice? And in some way, justice it's also like an appendage, or it's related to the form of the good, the ultimate form of the good. It's something like the way that the good manifests itself as an ordering principle in kind of material reality, is one way of thinking of justice. For Plato, he's trying to basically articulate justice But it's obvious that, for example, if you just say the word justice, that's not the same thing as intuiting the form of justice, the form that the word is meant to indicate or meant to express. Plato, takes him the whole dialogue to attempt this, and again, it's maybe something that's impossible in principle. In the same way that, if I had a mirror in front of me, it wouldn't do any good if I were blind. So similarly, unless that I have a sort of intuitive, intellectual vision of a form, it doesn't do me any good to learn about it. Still, though, reading the Republic can at least point us in some direction of intuiting this form. And for Plato, justice basically has something to do with, or one way of thinking about it is, well, one way that Plato tries to present it. Well, I've already given one, which is the parable of the cave. Another way he tries to point us towards an intellection of the form of justice is by setting up a foil against Socrates in the form of Thrasymachus. With Rudolf Steiner, we had two foils, Nietzsche and Kant. With Socrates, his primary foil is Thrasymachus, and Thrasymachus comes and almost as a Nietzschean character. There's a clear connection with Nietzsche's view and Thrasymachus' view. When asked to define justice, Thrasymachus says basically justice is the advantage of the stronger. And so what justice means is basically the survival of the fittest, or the strongest having its way over the weakest, dominating the weakest. And Socrates tries to, he first tries to understand what Thrasymachus means, and then he tries to draw out the implications of that view of justice. And ultimately, Socrates presents a different view of justice. And it has something much more to do with not the advantage of the stronger, not the subjugation of the weaker by the stronger, but rather something like justice as harmony. So it's not a kind of denial. It's not a sort of uniform denial of hierarchy. It's not an abolition of hierarchy, but it's rather a conception of hierarchy that actually entails some kind of reciprocity. In other words, the higher and everything that rules, it does so in the interest of what is beneath it. So the higher in some way has sort of cares for, or has responsibility for, the welfare of what is under its rule, and then at the same time, what is subordinate serves the higher. So the higher cares for the lower, while the lower serves the higher. This can seem quite abstract, but he gives many different examples, and maybe the most evocative example is just to think of the way that our brains, they are basic in our intelligence. It's responsible for taking care of our bodies, and so our bodies basically, they serve what the commands that our brains give them. But it's not as though it's not a sort of tyranny exactly, unless we have some kind of imbalance, and this is something that Plato addresses. But for Plato, justice, harmony, would be when our intelligence it cares for and has concern for our physical bodily health and well-being, while at the same time our body is not like revolting or our body is not in a condition of mutiny against our intelligence. And these are kind of two ways in which, for Plato, two archetypal ways in which justice can be skewed towards injustice. One of them would be a tyranny of the mind over the body. This could be some kind of extreme asceticism or austerity measures. Another form of injustice, the kind of opposite end of the spectrum, would be the sort of when the hierarchy is inverted. And basically, the mind is put under the subjugation of the body. And so basically everything that we do and every thought that we have is basically becomes just instrumental use of intelligence in order to satisfy sensual or bodily cravings. Like everything becomes a matter of being hungry all the time, or any kind of sensual fulfillment. In other words, the intelligence, which Plato has the idea that it's the function of the intelligence to rule over the body. It's not as though it's being tyrannical. It's just that that's what the intelligence is for. And so for Plato, any kind of subversion of that relationship is a kind of disharmony. It would be like a musical instrument that's out of tune, or a chord, a discord. So not a harmony, but a discord. The reason that it's not just a principle, but rather a form for Plato, and form sometimes it's translated as idea, but it's something like a transcendent idea. And the reason it's not just a theory or a concept, but rather a transcendent idea, is because what I just described about the body that's not the idea itself. That's only one expression of the idea. It's like one instance of the transcendent idea. The transcendent idea itself, well, there's no limit to how many instances it could have. So Plato in the Republic, the title of the Republic actually comes from one way that Plato immediately tries to express the form of justice is by using the image of a society. So you can try to express the form of justice through the image of hierarchy and harmony in the body and the mind, or you can do it through society. And Plato tries to say that that in the society that's ordered towards the good or ordered towards justice, there will be a very similar relation between sort of rulers or politicians and other people. And the idea is not that the politicians, they just tyrannize the people below them. In fact, Thrasymachus' idea, so Socrates' foil, sees rulership as the advantage of the ruler. So the reason somebody is a ruler is for the sake of for his own sake, in order to benefit him or herself alone. And Socrates sees it almost exactly the opposite way. And Socrates sees the function of the ruler is basically, well, it's to provide, just like the intelligence provides basically direction and responsibility for the welfare and the well-being of what is beneath it. So similarly, the ruler's position in a society is it's not for its own welfare, it's for the welfare of what it's ruling over. Socrates gives the analogy of a physician, and he says a good physician doesn't, if he's practicing his art, he doesn't help himself, he helps his subject. So similarly, a ruler, if he's doing a good job, doesn't help him or herself, he or she helps his or her subject. Right? And so, again, this is, well, the reason that, so you might ask, what do all of these analogies have in common? Like, what's the similarity between the image of the intelligence over the body compared to the ruler over the society? And the answer to this would be, if you can see the similarity between those two analogies, what the condition to be able to see those things, in other words, the reason that you can see it is because you are comparing it, or you're seeing it through the form of justice. In other words, if you can't see the similarity between those two examples, the society and the body, the social organism and the physical bodily organism, if you can't see the similarity between those two analogies, that's because you haven't yet grasped the form, or a person hasn't yet grasped the form. So a person who has grasped the form will be able to understand why those two analogies are similar. And so basically, for Plato's idea, we might think again, this is in service of trying to confront, trying to meet Schopenhauer's challenge of it's difficult to provide a basis for morality. From Socrates' view, or from Plato and Socrates' view, the answer to this is that, in fact, when we think that we are doing something to our advantage, in the way that Thrasymachus says, we are actually, well, it's clear that we're harming other people if we take advantage of other people. And so that's not really up for debate, but that doesn't bother Thrasymachus, because his view is like, again, it's the interest, justice is the interest of the stronger, the advantage of the stronger. So it doesn't really matter for Thrasymachus that we harm other people. He and Plato would be in agreement about that. Thrasymachus, though, imagines, again, when he thinks of an individual, he identifies that individual with that person's urges and desires and instincts, basically, just like Nietzsche does, and just like Rudolf Steiner says we shouldn't really do. For Socrates, it's clear that he doesn't make that same identification, and he basically sees, he thinks of, in other words, if I harm another person, not only have I harmed that other person, but I've also harmed myself. I've made myself a little bit worse by inflicting harm on another person. In other words, I've somehow tarnished my soul by doing evil. In the same way, by the same token, the more that I'm able to intuit and then line up my life, order my life towards the good. This is towards the benefit of everyone and everything around me, but it's also for the same reason it's to my own benefit, because I'm more in attunement with the form of the good. I'll just add a few. That's what I'll say about Plato and about Rudolf Steiner, and I hope that that basically, I hope that what I've said has at least presented two possible ways of meeting Schopenhauer's challenge, and again I've done it in the most sort of the steepest ascent, or taken the bull by the horn, so to speak, and address the challenge of trying to provide a basis for morality from the departure point of individual self-consciousness. Like it's comparatively easy to do it from shared religious belief, or from societal or organic consciousness. That's comparatively easy. It's especially challenging to try to do it starting from self-consciousness. But I hope that I've at least offered a start and given something of a beginning, and maybe anyone who views this lecture can. I hope that in some ways each of you can carry these thoughts forward and help to develop them. They're somewhat inchoate and not entirely worked out, and so I think it's a project that we can continue to work towards. But again, basically, just to recapitulate, Steiner would answer that the essence and the core, the pith of the individual is in the same way that the expression of a rose is the blossom of the rose. So similarly, and the rose is potentially, the blossom is potential in the rose, but it needs to be brought and tended towards manifestation. Similarly, for Steiner, every one of us is potentially free, but it's up to us to try to realize that potential within us and make it into actual freedom. And so for Steiner's answer, the basis for morality is kind of self-evolution toward freedom. Plato's view is basically the basis for the individual basis for ethics, for morality, is that the opposite of morality is not only does it lead to a condition of conflict, of outer conflict, of civil war. It leads to both civil war, outer civil war, and also civil war within our own souls. And by that I mean you end up with one desire in conflict with another desire, and no overarching principle of intelligence to guide them, to rule them, to minister them. And so for Plato, basically, it's a way to avoid civil war on all fronts. Not only societal civil war, but also internal conflict. So psychological war. It's a way to avoid being at odds within ourselves. It's a way to achieve harmony within our own souls. And so we're, in other words, both for Steiner and for Plato, we are better off. In fact, we're gaining something by being moral, by being ethical. And the only things that we are giving up are things that actually, that we're better off without them anyway. I'll add one final thought, and this is just sort of as a concluding thought. When we think of our own lives, we can imagine as though not everyone writes an autobiography, but somebody who did write an autobiography, what would they be writing about? Well, they would be writing about the subject matter of an autobiography is this person's life. So if I were going to write an autobiography, I would be writing about my life. And if I think of, if I try to conceptualize my life as a whole, which is somewhat challenging itself because it's one thing to conceptualize an object as a whole. That's straightforward because the whole object is spatially before me. But it's a little bit more challenging to conceptualize something as a whole that is not it's not as an object before me, but it rather it unfolds through time. So it's not a body in space so much as a body in time. That might seem very abstract, but at the same time, speech and music, especially, these are examples of ways in which we're sort of intuitively or semi-consciously doing that all the time. Just because one sound follows the next sound or one tone follows the next, it doesn't mean that we're not able to conceptualize a whole phrase or a whole symphony, a whole melody. We're somehow able to perceive the whole thing as one, despite that it unfolds itself sequentially through time. So if we try to think of our lives in a musical way, and by that I just mean as a coherent form in time, and not only as a body in space, but as a body in time, then I think it's quite straightforward how doing anything other than trying to order our lives towards the good and towards our own moral evolution, doing anything other than that clearly diminishes us. It clearly harms ourselves. It tarnishes our lives, and so I think it's almost so straightforward as that. In other words, to counter Schopenhauer's challenge, I think we can say it's doing anything other than striving towards the good. It harms me, and that's the basis for morality. So that's probably a good place to stop. We've covered quite a lot over this video, and I won't stop before wishing everyone the best, and also be happy to hear, and I hope that we can continue to carry on this discussion in the future. So again, farewell to everyone. Till next time.